Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Please welcome on the second day of the conference School versus Memory, ? We are, I hope, ready to start the fifth panel, which is chaired by Jan Randak, and it's about conflict and education. We'll see a number of important speakers here, and Jan Randak is going to moderate the panel in Czech. So if you need translation, please get your phones. Jan Randak is a scholar at the Faculty of Arts of the Charles University in here, and I would like to use this opportunity to thank him for being part of the program committee and active member. Thank you, and just a small reminder, after this session there will be a second part of the poster/coffee break, so the people that brought their presentations in the form of posters or other forms, videos and so on, should be there ready to discuss their projects and their understanding of our topics in person. Thank you very much, and please enjoy. The floor is yours, Mr. Randak.
Děkuji za slovo. Dobré ráno, dámy a pánové, milé kolegyně, milí kolegové. Dovolte mi, abych zahájil dnešní sobotní jednání konference věnované škole a paměti s tím, že na začátek vám řeknu několik technických, respektive organizačních informací. Bohužel z jednání konference se omluvila paní Anida Sokol, byť je stále v programu. Ona se momentálně připravuje na obhajobu své dizertační práce, tudíž bohužel nedorazí. Stejně tak kvůli nečekaným problémům s dopravou nemohla dorazit ani paní Déry. To znamená, že díky těmto dvěma absencím budeme mít menší počet referentů, ale o to více času na příspěvek hlavního řečníka, kterým je Peter Seixas, a hlavně na vaše otázky v průběhu v rámci diskuze, která, věřím, bude jistě podnětná a plodná. Každý referent má vyhrazený čas 15 minut. Já velmi prosím řečníky a referenty, aby těch 15 minut dodrželi. Hlavní referát, hlavní řečník bude mít k dispozici více času, zhruba 30 minut. Diskuze bude následovat na závěr tohoto panelu a já prosím všechny tazatele o položení jasných, stručných otázek na jednotlivé panelisty, respektive pokud budete pokládat nějaké obecné nebo nějaké generální otázky, tak jednotliví panelisté se jich chopí podle vlastní úvahy. Teď ale už přejdeme k našemu programu. Já bych chtěl přivítat mezi námi hlavního řečníka, kterým je Peter Seixas. Ten působí na univerzitě v Britské Kolumbii, současně je jedním ze zakládajících členů a současně i ředitelem Centra pro výzkum historického vědomí. Zabývá se tedy historickým vědomím mladých lidí, či vzděláváním a profesním růstem učitelů. A v následujících minutách přednese svůj příspěvek s názvem Historie se potkává se životem s podtitulem Historické vědomí ve školním dějepise. Já ho vítám mezi námi a tím tomu předávám slovo.
Thank you very much. I'm delighted to follow such a stimulating day yesterday and trust that today will be as full of ideas. And I'm delighted to know that we may actually have some time for discussion at the end of this session. The conference program defines a tension between history education in schools and memory at the level of family, social group, or community. This paper explores and challenges that tension. In many, if not most, of today's democratic states, history education in schools is itself a zone of conflict between forces that seek to perpetuate and extend a national mythic and memorial role for school history, and those who see school history as a locus for introducing students to a disciplinary and critical study of the past. Through the 19th and most of the 20th century, school history was driven largely by memorial purposes and practices, motivated by a need to secure national solidarity and promote nascent national identities. These functions of history education have not disappeared in the 21st century. The impulse to have history education work in this way may be particularly strong among politicians seeking to unite those divided by new immigration or old ethnic loyalties, and in places emerging over the shorter or longer term from conflicts and historical injustices. This paper explores the possibility of a school history as more than a narrative whose purpose is the promotion of triumphant national consensus in the face of competing family, ethnic, and community narratives. I don't have a clicker. See? So which conflict shall we focus on? And I've used italics in this slide to show the distinction between the two subtly different and yet significantly different conflicts that we could entertain. The first one, community memory or family memory or social memory versus school history, defined as a problem of conflicting narratives, or national mythic memory in schools versus history in schools. And it's the latter conflict that I'm going to focus on, given that schools are a locus where we can have significant policy impact. The terms memory and history are unfortunately used in many ways with overlapping meanings. Indeed, the compound phrase historical memory is also widely used, confusing the field further. Defining the relationship is bound to be complex and to a certain degree stipulative. So I'm going to leap in with the boldest of dichotomies and separate these two completely. Memory is a deeply felt understanding of the past which reaffirms community ties and collective identities. It defines collective rights and wrongs, heroism and villainy of the remembered past. Memory is a force for continuity and connection through the community and across generations. It thrives on preservation and enhancement rather than evidence and critique. In contrast, the critical and reflective methodology of history is grounded on historical sources and historiographic debate. If memory belongs to a community, as Nora says, history belongs to everyone and no one. To frame the distinction in its most stark and contrasting way, we might say memory is emotional and close, history is rational and distant. The practices of memory are well suited to isolated, homogeneous traditional societies, where unquestioned belief and preservation of a single narrative of origins and identities works well for the community. In the heterogeneous and connected world of postmodernity, with its multicultural societies and multinational polities, memory works in an entirely different way. It continues at the local face-to-face level in small communities, but has only the crudest of tools to deal with the multiple narratives and conflicting stories that circulate in the larger world we face today. So then we are left with this question. Schools must be oriented in a way that can speak to, sorry, this is not a question, this is a very declarative statement. Schools must be oriented in a way that can speak to and connect with the memorial beliefs of the school's communities and yet stand above them. They cannot simply offer a super myth or grand narrative of national memory. They have to provide something altogether different, history. So I'm going to explain, what I've just explained to you is the outline, is the introduction to the paper, and then the rest of the paper will be in three more parts. In order to demonstrate the poverty of understanding school history versus community memory simply as a problem of conflicting narratives, I will start by discussing the national commemorations that are sweeping Canada in the second decade of the 21st century. These are super myths typical of national mythic revivals internationally, and their counterpart, critical history in the schools, which is also alive and well in Canada. This juxtaposition opens up the question, which will be entertained in part 3, can the alternative to this mythic commemorative history, a deliberative critical school history, serve as a fair solution to the problem of competing memorial narratives that circulate everywhere in the conflict-ridden and connected world that we now inhabit? How can it satisfy the needs for community identity and moral orientation that memorial narratives address so clearly? And finally, in order to answer that question, I use recent examples from Britain, Germany, Sweden, and the Netherlands to discuss the ways that it can.
Sorry, would you mind just a little interruption? You're reading the text, we don't have the text, your interpreter's very on the machine. Could you please perhaps read a little more slowly and provide a copy?
I'm so sorry. Okay.
It's just, it's impossible to do that. So,
Okay.
and, it's way beyond anybody's capabilities.
Okay.
I do apologize to
I
you.
apologize to you. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
It's we just really
Let me ask, this is a problem with translation, and I would like to know how many people are listening in translation. Okay, I apologize. I made a change last night to go from the slides to reading the text, and I didn't think of this problem. So maybe I'll go more slowly, and I will. I can give you my computer, or no, I can't. No. But if you want to read, can you read it? No, I don't have another copy.
Anyway, so if you...
Okay, I will adjust. I'll go from the slides. Okay. And where I don't go from the slides, I will go slowly. So, Canada is a large land, second only to Russia in the size of its land, but its population is only 35 million. So it's, in terms of population, it's relatively small. It is not only linguistically divided, but nationally ambiguous. In Quebec, Je me souviens is on the license plates. And Je me souviens refers to the conquest. I remember the conquest of 1759. The national legislature in Quebec, the legislature in Quebec is called the National Assembly. In addition, so Quebec is a nation within Canada. In addition, there are Aboriginal First Nations divided among 50 First Nations, not territorially contiguous. So that's another national identity. Immigration to Canada is one of the largest immigration rates in the world, at 1% of the population annually over the past decade. And then there's the rest of Canada, which has no other national identity other than Canada. They are Canadians. So it's a kind of unequal nationalism that forms a real problem for a Canadian government confronting the problem of national memory in the service of solidarity and identity. In fact, Canada is in the midst of a state-sponsored orgy of national commemoration. This is not school history, but it attempts to perform the kinds of nation-building functions that school history conceived in that way does. Thus, it can provide insight into the functions of institutional, state-sponsored commemoration, and specifically the gap between these practices and those of history. In 2012, the Government of Canada committed some $25 million towards celebrating the bicentennial of the War of 1812, a war fought between the British and the Americans, which was not much on the radar of, in popular Canadian memory prior to this time. The government established a website and many other activities, and the Prime Minister's message on the project's website embodies a lot of the commemorative project. I invite all Canadians to share in our history and commemorate our proud and brave ancestors who fought and won against enormous odds. As we near our country's 150th anniversary in 2017, Canadians have an opportunity to pay tribute to our founders, defining moments, and heroes who fought for Canada. So the Prime Minister linked the military aspects of the War of 1812 to the origin story of Canada as an aid in promoting a coherent and solidary national identity. In these kinds of commemorative activities, it didn't matter that there had been deeply divided loyalties on both sides of the border with the United States in 1812, nor that as a nation of immigrants, most present-day Canadian citizens could not trace their families back to the ancestors that he mentions, and that Canada at the time was nothing more than a few sparsely populated British colonies, nor that those who fought against the Americans were primarily British forces. The campaign was supposed to create a memory that would bolster Canadian identity and solidarity by constructing a past to suit the present. The message went on from the Prime Minister. The war helped establish our path toward becoming an independent and free country, united under the Crown with a respect for linguistic and ethnic diversity. The heroic efforts of Canadians helped define who we are today, what side of the border we live on, and which flag we salute. And the campaign was bolstered in a number of ways. This is an advertisement which appeared in Canada's national newspaper, the Globe and Mail, put in by Fort York, which was the site of some of the battles, and with the message, "What do you know about the fight for Canada?" And you probably can't read in the middle line, it says, "If not for Fort York," and the bottom star on the American flag is actually a Canadian maple leaf. So again, a war which is sought to, in contemporary terms in this campaign, it was a defining origin for Canada. If not for these battles, Canada would simply be another star in the Star-Spangled Banner. So these activities were part of a drive among politicians of a certain stripe to promote a national or imperial collective identity as an avenue toward social solidarity, nation building, and the downplaying of communitarian diversity and difference. It emphasized pride, character, suffering, heroism, and triumph over the other, a classic, mythic, and memorial kind of narrative in the service of national identity. Now, the problems that the Canadian government has tried to address through recent national memorial campaigns are relatively benign compared to most places in the world. Canada is not an unpleasant place for most of its residents, but the elements that enable comparison to other national contexts should be apparent. Multiple languages, large immigrant populations, groups that are defined in part through historical crimes which they endured and whose legacies persist into the present, and on the other hand, a central government whose legitimacy depends on an acceptable level of shared civic commitment and social solidarity. These conditions can be seen elsewhere around the world, often in more extreme and dangerous forms. The challenge for schools, then, is neither to resurrect the national narrative, as the Canadian government is attempting to do with its commemoration program, nor to worry about dominant national narratives suppressing competing, conflicting local, ethnic, and community memories. Rather, it is to align the particular affordances that are provided by a space for history curriculum in the schools with the cultural demands of a divided society, coming to terms with legacies of division, racism, dispossession, colonialism, and war. This move is well underway in Canada, and I will just highlight to you a series of meetings starting in 1999 gave rise to a number of organizations that became almost a national campaign, a pan-Canadian campaign, to see that the schools would take more of these directions, and that is critical history in Canadian schools. And these are exemplified by the Historical Thinking Project, which started in 2006, in order to promote critical historical literacy for the 21st century. And it used second-order historical thinking concepts in order to define historical thinking, as you see in the slide, to establish historical significance, use primary source evidence, identify continuity and change, analyze cause and consequence, take historical perspectives, and understand the ethical dimension of history. The question is, and it remains, can a critical history education, as defined like this, satisfy the need for community identity and moral orientation? And in order to answer that question, we're going to look at examples from Britain, Germany, Sweden, and the Netherlands. The British Schools Council History Project started in 1972. And I think its spirit is captured by this quotation from Peter Rogers from 1987, who asked, "On what grounds can we be sure that the version of the past experienced in historical education is preferable to those acquired in the ordinary process of growing up? Could it be no more than an alternative prejudice? How can we know that it is not?" It was not that a better narrative could or would be taught in schools, but that the grounds for any historical narrative would be made transparent, and students would understand the rational analysis of historical evidence as having a different weight from narratives simply passed down from mother to children, from priest to congregation, or from teacher to students. It was based on the procedural or second-order concepts, and this was stated by Peter Lee and Roz Ashby, Concepts like historical evidence, explanation, change, and accounts are ideas that provide our understanding of history as a discipline or form of knowledge. They're not what history is about, but they shape the way that we go about doing history. As the British research focused on mapping and measuring the progression of students' understanding of second-order concepts, Dennis Chenault's notion that history could teach a way for rational knowledge to trump agglomerated belief was a key principle. But it stopped short. Indeed, explicitly rejected the notion of addressing questions of students' identity or teaching explicitly about the relationship of history to issues of contemporary life. And this is where the Germans come in, and you've already seen this slide kindly presented yesterday by Stefan Lebeck, the disciplinary matrix of Jorn Roosen. And I don't want to go into any detail about the elements, except to draw your attention, as Stefan did yesterday, about the division between the historical discipline above the dotted line in the center and life practice below the line in the center, and the fact that Roosen's attempt here was to show the interconnection, the flow from life practice to the questions and theories of the historical discipline, and then the products of academic history flowing back into the life practice and the thinking and the working and the decision making and the identity forming of people in the larger world. Among several contrasts between British and German developments, perhaps most interesting is the degree to which the term historical consciousness opened the possibility of linking disciplinary history to everyday life. The British consistently distinguished between the rational practices of history and other more emotionally driven forms of memory practice arising from contemporary needs and desires. Roosen mapped the basis for historical consciousness in terms of the relationships between the discipline and everyday life. And Roosen's work led to the further work by Andreas Kerber and his colleagues in what they call the Fuhr model. And what they have tried to do is to refine the somewhat theoretical writings of Jorn Roosen into something which would be much more usable for those designing curriculum and assessments for the schools by translating those into student competencies. And they would focus on all those often neglected competencies needed for actually using the historical information for personal or collective orientation in the present and the future, coming to new terms with one's own personal relationship to the deeds, merits, and sins of one's ancestors. The German discourse is thus a long way from the British approach, which has no place at all for ethical concerns on this level. While it is perhaps not surprising in a nation whose families within generational memory were part of a Nazi state, it also has widespread applicability in post-conflict, post-colonial, and other divided societies where the need to come to terms with the past is imperative, and where schools' abdication of a role in doing so is either immoral or dangerous. The Swedish national curriculum used much of the same theoretical foundation. And unlike the Germans, who have proceeded piecemeal in terms of actually implementing these ideas, the Swedes instituted in 2011 and 2012 a national curriculum based on 3 historical competencies. And one of those 3 basic historical competencies involves what you see on the screen. Students will understand the function of historical narratives for individual orientation in life and how different actors in society use history as a means to influence people's perception of the past, their orientation in the present, and subsequently the future. The Dutch heritage education proceeds in very similar lines and has among its goals, again, a national curriculum that students will understand the changing significance of the past for different groups of people in the past and in current societies, and the recognition of various present motives, values, and expectations when people make moral judgments about the past. So each of these 3 national contexts, which moved beyond the British, made clear attempts to link the identity practices, the questions of moral action, the questions of debts from the past, to the disciplinary thinking involved in history. And I'd like to jump now to a conclusion, and I'm going to try to read my conclusion slowly because I see that it's much better on the page than anything I can do from these 2 short bullets. And translators, please yell from the back if I'm going too quickly. In its scientific approach, the promotion of disciplinary understandings of history often aims for a distance, temporal, emotional, and ideological, from the past. While this can be a strain, it also threatens to leave unmet the hunger for cultural identity and social solidarity that are fed by celebration and commemoration. The challenge is to address these impulses in an ethical and sustainable way in societies with mixed and divided populations, with diverse memory cultures and historical grievances. Under these circumstances, the history that is taught in schools can and should be conceptualized as operating in another closely related realm. While the British model of source analysis and second-order concepts offers the critical tools to examine the past, the German, Swedish, and Dutch experiments go a step further. They draw the lines connecting an intellectual, critical history to mythic, emotionally meaningful memory. By comparison, students in a literature classroom may study the evolution of the novel, fiction writers' stylistic techniques at the level of sentences and paragraphs, or authors' choices in the construction of voice and plot. The purpose of such study is not to destroy the pleasure of reading. Rather, it is to provide insight into how fiction works, or for students to read like a writer. It provides a larger view. It educates. Similarly, the study of comparative religions in schools and universities might be seen in the same way. The examination of the evolution of belief systems, their component elements, their similarities and differences, need not be seen as a frontal attack on religion, and generally speaking, it is not. And yet, seriously engaged with, it should be a counterpoint to ethnocentrism, rabid fundamentalism, and naive superstition. School history's relationship to mythic belief and memorial celebration, whether those of an ethnic community or a national state, should be understood in the same way as literature and religion classes. To provide this educative function, it cannot take the form of yet one more either competing or confirming narrative. Rather, it takes one step back from the narrative, mobilizing the achievements of critical disciplinary history in a way that transcends mythic belief by operating on a different plane. This is the only history education appropriate to the globalizing, multinational, multicultural, post-colonial world we now inhabit. Because state-run public schools have the opportunity to engage all young people every week over multiple years with highly trained professional history teachers, we have a clear opportunity to lay the groundwork for such a complex, sophisticated, and cosmopolitan approach to the past, a history worthy of the term education. Thank you.
Děkuji za příspěvek. Slyšeli jsme referát věnovaný tedy v principu vztahu státního paměťového provozu, školního provozu a rodinné, respektive komunitní paměti. Podívali jsme se do různých státních prostředí, slyšeli jsme o potřebě časového, emočního, ideologického odstupu od minulosti. Já si myslím, že tento referát vyvolá ještě řadu diskuzních příspěvků, řadu otázek. Jak jsem byl informován, na diskuzi budeme mít a na vaše otázky budeme mít ještě trochu více času, neboť z jednání konference se omluvil i pan kolega Aleksandr Světlov. To znamená, nyní máme na programu pouze další dva příspěvky a jako další referát dalšího řečníka poprosím za chvíli o slovo paní Katrin Kelo. Paní Katrin Kelo působí na Institutu společenských nebo sociálních studií na univerzitě v Tartu v Estonsku, kde by podle mých informací měla právě na konci října obhajovat svou dizertační práci a zároveň působí v oddělení sociální a hospodářské psychologie na univerzitě Jana Keplera v Linci v Rakousku. V následujících minutách bude hovořit o konfliktních střetech minulosti v rozdělených společnostech. Já ji mezi námi vítám, jsem rád, že dorazila a tímto jí předávám slovo.
Thank you very much and good morning to everyone. I feel really happy and honored to be able to present here today. And my presentation is based on several papers which are either already published or in press, and to acknowledge duly my co-authors, I have also listed them on the slide. And the point of view which I would like to contribute and which attaches itself nicely to what Professor Seix has presented is the point of view of history teacher who faces these different conceptions of what history teaching is and what it should achieve and what it should do, and these different political, societal and also academic expectations to history teaching and didactic proposals. And this point of view derives from my own multiple biographical experiences. I have studied history and I have worked in curriculum development field and curriculum research, and now I have also come to social science and social psychology. I perhaps see better these different contexts which influence teachers' perceptions of their possibilities and action choices. That is to say, I would like to point to the multiplicity of the factors that influence teachers' readiness to apply, for example, such critical approaches to history teaching, or any other approaches in the broadest sense. And some of these factors, as the title of the presentation shows, is the teacher's personal sense of his or her autonomy, and also how she perceives the context. And that could be also named teacher's action space. Teacher's action space in terms of action choices as determined both by perceived and actual or internal and external factors and limitations, how the teachers themselves perceive them and how we as researchers can, so to say, more objectively see them. I agree with those authors who view this teacher's action space as locally differing constellations of various contextual factors, such as academic research and education structures and social and political context. And this scheme is just to show better their interrelations and that there are no clear hierarchies between those different factors, neither as giving inputs into curriculum nor as perceived by teachers. So even if there is a clear national curriculum, then still those other factors also influence how teachers see history teaching and their tasks. And of course, this distinction on the scheme is analytical and simplifying. For example, the social and political contexts embrace both the social and public, like Sirkka Ahonen yesterday distinguished. But I think it helps to see the multiplicity of the context. And my presentation is based on interviews with Estonian and Latvian history teachers who, as Uku Lemba told us already yesterday, work in rather interesting contexts. Because both Estonian and Latvian societies, there are not only different interpretations about the past, very present politically and hot even and often used by politicians, but also these societies are characterized by a mnemonic divide. That is to say, there are two large cultural communities which see the past broadly from somewhat different perspectives. So it has to do with this dominantly bi-ethnic structure of the two societies. And this has also resulted in a somewhat high-end public attention towards history teaching. For example, the majority public often suspects the minority history teachers, but that perhaps their view is not the correct one towards the past, or perhaps they still teach some kind of Soviet history. And the teachers, of course, perceive this, so to say, suspicion. So there are some main conflict lines and sensitivities in the society. Uku Lemba also mentioned them. They have mainly to do with the Soviet past, which, according to surveys, is roughly seen differently by the Russian-speaking and the Estonian and Latvian-speaking population. The ethnic or indigenous Estonians, Latvians tend to be more negative towards the Soviet time, and the Russian speakers tend to be more positive or neutral. And there are also, of course, different sensitivities. For example, from the Russian speakers' perspective, one painful thing has been the renaming of their great patriotic war into the simple word War II, also in history teaching and textbooks and curriculum. And on the other hand, for many indigenous Estonian and Latvian speakers, the calling Soviet time occupation is very important emotionally, and of course it's again resisted by many Russian speakers. And in education field, there are also tensions between whereas pedagogical traditions, which is certainly a more general phenomenon, more constructivist approaches have come to Estonia and Latvia since 90s. So during the Soviet time, the teaching was generally more, as we know, a traditional teacher-centered and also authoritarian. And these new student-centered, more constructivist approaches have been acquired by teachers to different extents. And the education system in general has gone through many changes. So from great liberalism in early 90s to more external control, but still the teachers have quite a lot of autonomy. And the main thing that during my interviews, at the time of my interviews, was like external control on teachers, the national final examinations in history, but not all students take them, and now they don't exist anymore. But during the interviews they were important. But for the context and content and interpretations, there is quite a lot of, actually, from my view, from my research view, autonomy by teachers. But the teachers perceived it really differently, and that's what I want to talk about. So one more thing about the history teaching. During Soviet times, it was, one aim of it was, of course, just to give knowledge and develop some analytic skills and cause and consequence understanding in students. But the other was so enhancing Soviet patriotism and communist values. And then since the 90s, it turned, and Estonian and Latvian national story became the center of the teaching, accompanied by more critical approaches which were imported from Western Europe. So the national curricula were actually contradictory. They had these introductions which said that history teaching should be multi-perspective and open and offer different interpretations, but the syllabus or the topic lists rather reminded of a traditional contents of a great story, so to say. So from a teacher's perspective, that each reader has a choice on which aspects in the curriculum he or she focuses or how he or she puts these two aspects together. So these external contexts of history teaching, on the one hand, are complicated politically and socially, and on the other hand, the curriculum can be interpreted in different ways. My interviews with teachers reflected this, that there were really different ways how they described history teaching itself and its context. And these two aspects seem to be at least discursively connected to each other. On the one hand, an open, pluralistic and also critical approach, which shows the context also as more liberal and open, and on the other hand, so to say, a more traditional hierarchical authoritarian representation of history teaching. So this first one, the closed and more open, it really showed a context where there is a state textbook and history teaching and somehow a univocal picture which should be transmitted in school. And this was connected also to a representation of teaching where teachers tried to avoid complicated or dangerous moments or discussions where, for example, critical voices could be voiced by students. So they tried to avoid or generalize such topics which perhaps the Russian-speaking students would say, oh, okay, this is actually differently, the textbook is lying, or the state doesn't represent it in the right way. And they also, in this representation, would hide teachers' own views, because they are not important, because teacher is servant of the state and has to transmit some certain image. So they focus on they look more what the politicians expect, and they perhaps perceive more certain textbooks, because there are different textbooks among which teachers can choose, and in some textbooks there really is very strongly this national narrative still. And on the other hand, I talked to teachers who represented the context of history teaching and the textbook itself as open and liberal and pluralistic, and in this representation the textbook was not anymore something which represented the state, but something that represented the two authors who wrote it. I always say, I say it constantly, the book is written by two authors. We don't have to learn it by heart. These are just two out of 6 billion people who are announced their point of view here. Yes, they have worked on this issue for a long time, but they are common people. So they are not like authorities anymore so much. And they also try to show that just like in history there are always different views, or just like in life there are always different views, even in marriages or in divorces. So it's always in history too. And they didn't attempt to reconcile, or in their representation, they didn't try to reconcile or find this one true. They more said that they tried to give students tools or to cope with this diversity, so that students can learn better to deal with different interpretations. And they asked students also make surveys so that they could bring this diversity into the classroom and discuss it. Not avoiding, but enhancing it. And also during this, so to say, epistemological explanation that there will always be different views and there are different perspectives to the past, they didn't try to reconcile the knowledge about the past, but they somehow try to reconcile the memory communities in a society. So they told that, for example, to Russian students, that Estonians have other view and we have other view, and that's just how it is, but also your granny and your grandpa have different views. So they took this mediator position, not only between textbook and student or academic knowledge and everyday knowledge, but also between different communities in the country, and also between different states, even Russia and Estonia and other countries. So there are at least discursively connections between the teacher's professional stance and his or her worldview more generally. And there are different aspects which come together. I think how teacher perceives and represents her action choices and possibilities, not only his or her pedagogical repertoire and perception of own and students' abilities, but also epistemological position, personal openness, and image of the social and political and academic context, and of course self-confidence, because dangerous moments can arise if you enhance discussion and openness. And this expression dangerous moments also comes from a teacher who tried to avoid them. So there's also this how cool or hot an issue is for teacher, and all those emotional aspects which haven't found so much attention in research on history teaching yet, I think. But for example, Byulas and Kambani from Cyprus have studied it, and I agree that perhaps it could be studied more. So to conclude, it seems that teachers' professional autonomy, as subjectively perceived, may be related to how differentiated are the contextual fields as perceived by him or her, and how he or she copes with these differences. And these images of the social, political and academic spaces that surround schooling are relevant in forming their sense of confidence and legitimacy in teaching, and also how they interpret the curriculum, be the curriculum very clear or ambivalent as in Estonian and Latvian. So, and I feel that this aspect could deserve more attention by research in different contexts, not only in clearly divided and post-conflict societies. And then, of course, attention must be paid to the different legal contexts, which are also very different, of history teaching. Thank you very much.
Já děkuji Katrin Kelo za příspěvek. Katrin Kelo hovořila o učitelích dějepisu, o výuce dějepisu a očekávání smyslu výuky dějepisu, o autonomii učitele v přístupu k podání látky a o tématu pro mě osobně zajímavém o sovětské zkušenosti. Opět věřím, že její příspěvek přinese nebo vyvolá ve vás řadu otázek, a které se projeví nebo které zazní v diskuzi. A neplánovaně, ale přesto už nyní přistupujeme k poslednímu příspěvku našeho bloku. Já mezi námi vítám paní Sylvii Balgarinov, která je momentálně doktorantkou na univerzitě v Portsmouthu ve Velké Británii, kde se věnuje proměnám obrazu národa a Evropy v polských učebnicích dějepisu po roce 1989. Její příspěvek nese příznačný název Polští pachatelé, otázka s podtitulem Polské učebnice dějepisu a paměť masakru v Jedvabném. A já v tuto chvíli prosím Sylvii Balgarinov o slovo, o její příspěvek.
Thank you. It's easier for me to stand. I talk and I move. And yes, you said I'm in my third year of PhD at the Center for European International Studies Research, and I'll talk to you about Polish perpetrators, history textbooks, and the memory of the Jedwabne massacre. Before I do so, however, I would like to take this opportunity to tell you a little bit more about my PhD research. The title is Narrating the Past, Changing Images of a Nation and Europe in Polish History Textbooks after 1989. And I'm looking at history textbooks. You all know them. They are stories of the past. They're used in schools. We use them for teaching. We learn from them. We also know from the literature on nationalism that in 18th and 19th century, history textbooks were used by states to create nations, to create imagined communities. And I ask in my PhD, I ask about the role of the state. So I ask of the role of the state in those pluralistic societies, societies like Poland after '89. And I ask about the role of societal groups, non-state actors as well. So what I say is that I ask about who is the state, who are the people who represent the state, who are the people working for the Ministry of Education, and who are the non-state actors participating in textbook development. Therefore, I look at textbooks in different contexts, in political, historiographical, cultural contexts, but I also look at publishing markets, international organizations, and transnational textbook revision. And this seems like a lot, right? Therefore, I have two questions that actually guide my research. So the first one, how have narratives in Polish history textbooks changed after '89? And the second question is, who aims to influence or who creates the stories of the past in Polish history textbooks? And let me tell you more about the methodology first. So in order to compare history textbooks and their narrative, I analyzed them. And some of you probably already know that after '89 in Poland, we had frequent change of textbooks, what meant that there were quite few of them printed, and I was not able to analyze all of them, and I had to find some sort of criteria in order to narrow the number of textbooks down. because there was no data on most widely used textbooks, I had to find some sort of different criteria. Therefore, I decided to look at textbooks for teaching 20th century, and then I took textbooks that were introduced after the transition in 1989 and 1993, then textbooks introduced after the major structural reform of education of 1999, and then textbooks that were introduced by the change of curricula in 2009. So every 10 years. And then still I ended up with 23 history textbooks, quite few to analyze. Therefore, I decided to look at World War II, which is still hotly debated in Poland, and then I chose to look at events that show the images of nations. So Katyn massacre, Jedwabne massacre, Warsaw Uprising, and the expulsions of Germans after 1945. And then for the images of Europe, I decided to look at Yalta and Potsdam conferences, and then Polish accession to the EU. And I look at how the concept of Europe changed. And today, in particular, I'll talk about Jedwabne massacre of 1941. And I'll do so in a minute. Before, I just want to tell you a little bit more about the second question of my research. So who tries to influence or who tries to create narratives in history textbooks? And I conduct qualitative social network analysis in two phases. In the first phase that I already completed, I listed different institutions and different individuals who participated in the development or tried to influence the development of textbooks in these 3 years, 1989, 1999, and 2009. And then I link this to the analysis of relationships. That's phase 2 of my research, when I try to map different relationships between institutions, and individuals, and institutions and individuals. And then I also try to map their links to narratives in history textbooks and their strategies, and how they try to influence what makes its way to history textbooks. And so far I've conducted 29 interviews with domestic and transnational actors, so with textbook authors, textbook reviewers, textbook editors, owners of publishing houses, bureaucrats from the Ministry of Education, ministers of education, curricula authors, museums, research institutes, as well as transnational actors, so bilateral textbook commissions, UNESCO and the Council of Europe. So quite few categories that I try to include in my research in order to understand this context, as you mentioned before, that are relevant for production of narratives. Here it is. And the case study that I prepared for this conference is one of the events, is the Jedwabne massacre on July 10th, 1941, in a small town of Jedwabne in northeast of Poland. A murder of Jewish population was committed. At the time when the town was occupied by German troops, Jewish people had been locked in a barn and burned alive. The murder was forgotten in communist Poland, as it happened with so many other atrocities committed during the Second World War. However, in 2000, Jan Tomasz Gross, an American historian of Polish origin, published a book, Sąsiedzi, that in 2001 was translated into English, Neighbors. And in his book, he described how Poles killed 1,600 Jews. And of course, the book has triggered this huge debate in Poland. At first, the debate centered around the question of the accuracy of Gross's account. And Institute for Public Remembrance or National Remembrance has carried out an examination of the massacre, and it was established that probably 300 Jews were murdered. Nevertheless, and what is even more important, is that the debate has triggered this debate, the book has triggered this debate about Polish-Jewish relations during the war, and the question that was very important at the time was whether Poles were perpetrators in the Second World War. And many historians now would argue that the Jedwabne debate was the most important debate in Poland since 1945, as it challenged the concept of suffering, victimhood, martyrdom, on which Polish ethnic nationalism historically built. As a result of the debate, two perspectives have emerged on remembering Polish past. And on one hand, we have those who want to face the past and who see Jedwabne as a crucial historical event that Poles have to be constantly reminded of in order to understand that they were not just victims and heroes, but also perpetrators in crimes against others. And on the other hand, we have those perceiving Jedwabne massacre as anti-Polish propaganda, and they see Jedwabne as a symbol of Poland's unjustified humiliation and dishonor. Therefore, this polarization, I argue, and the presence of information about the Jedwabne massacre in a textbook can therefore be seen as an indication of participation in one of the debates. So what I do is that I look at how the Jedwabne massacre is portrayed in history textbooks across these different years, and whether these debates are actually reflected in textbooks, and how textbooks try to participate in these debates. But let me go back in time a little bit. 1890, before the debate, textbook actually by Andrzej Leszek Szcześniak, the only history textbooks used at the time in 1989, did not obviously mention the massacre at all. Nevertheless, the author discussed Polish-Jewish matters, and I found only two categories present in the textbook: category of heroes and victims that are actually in symbiosis with each other. And he wrote that due to sacrifice of Polish society, it was possible to save about 100,000 of Jews from extermination. He also said that in retaliation for aiding Polish partisans, holding in ransom Soviet prisoners and Jews, and for not supplying quarters, Nazis violently suppressed villages, murdered Polish population, and burned buildings. So we have those two categories in 1989, 1990, before the debate took place. Poles were victims and heroes of the Second World War. Textbooks that were written during the debate, I analyzed. These were the textbooks introduced by the reform of 1990, the big reform in Poland. 12 new history textbooks were introduced, and they were gradually introduced, and they reached schools in school year 2001-2002. And this was obviously the time when the Jedwabne debate was starting and really took off. And then some may argue, therefore, that textbooks, that they were already published and they were already under work, and it was too late to take part in the debate. Nevertheless, many authors of the textbooks were actually historians who were participating in these public debates. And I find in those textbooks 4 categories. We have this old category of victims and heroes. So Wendt, for example, writes that in 1941, Germans introduced in Poland, the only country under German occupation, a death penalty for sheltering and helping Jews. Despite this, the number of Polish helpers did not increase. Then, however, very interesting category of bystanders is introduced, and Mędrzecki and Szuchta, for example, say that the attitude of indifference towards the Holocaust was dominant. And this is a very interesting category that is introduced to textbooks. So there is this link between the debate and textbooks, I think. And then an interesting but difficult category is the category of perpetrators. And none of the textbooks actually admits full Polish responsibility for the massacre, and textbooks that do so, they consider Poles, they seek for justification of their crimes. So they push responsibility towards Soviets and Germans, so they say that Poles were influenced by the politics of Soviets and Germans in this territory. And Mędrzecki and Szuchta, for example, they say that there were instances of reporting about Jews to Germans. However, they conclude that this does not justify the occasional appearances of voices claiming Polish responsibility for the Holocaust. So this category of perpetrators is discussed, but the responsibility is not admitted. Then, in textbooks, sorry for the slide, I know it's too much. In textbooks in 2009, so the textbooks introduced after the debate, this changes. I just want to make a quick point. 2009 and 2008 is when Poland is a memory land, like any other country in Europe, according to Sharon MacDonald. And 2009 is also the time when new history curricula is introduced to Polish schools. And interestingly, a whole year is assigned to teaching about 20th century. And this is when my new textbooks come in. And what I find is that those narratives are significantly different, and the spectrum of my narratives is wider. And I find, again, four categories of Polish participation in the and Polish-Jewish relations. And I find category of victims like before, the category of heroes, and these are stressed by particular textbooks. So victims, the category of victims is particularly stressed by the textbook by Roszak and Kłaczkow, the category of heroes is stressed in the textbook by Kozłowska, Zając, and Unger. And then 3 of the textbooks particularly stress the category of Poles as bystanders, and they say that the majority of Poles was passive, but then they put different stress on those remaining categories. So they, for example, say that they were bystanders, but they did take the risk to help Jews, while Stoa, for example, he points out that they were bystanders, but they did have their own part in a crime. And then 3 of the textbooks, they do engage with the category of perpetrators, and they do so in a different manner. The first textbook by Ustrzycki offers a vision of Poles being victims of German propaganda when carrying out the Jedwabne massacre. Brzozowski and Szczepański, they put the responsibility on the region where it happened, so there's this internal divide suddenly. And then the third textbook that talks about Jedwabne actually puts responsibility for the massacre on Poles, so it is admitted that Poles committed the crime. So it is very interesting how different these narratives actually are, and how they participate, and how they try to develop those different categories. And then something I prepared just for this conference is oh god, 5 minutes, great, thank you. Is whether textbooks relate to the Jedwabne debate, and whether they actually try to explain how the Jedwabne debate happened and why, and whether the concept of memory is explained, and whether they talk about politics of memory and amnesia about the crime during the Second World War, and then, of the crime in the Second World War during the communism. And what I find is that none of the textbooks actually tries to explain to students that there was a debate, that it was discussed, that it was a hot, big topic. And that probably doesn't surprise you. And then with regards to family memory, I ask of whether there's place for reflection on how the Jedwabne massacre and Jewish-Polish relations were remembered by families, societal groups, or regions. And I looked at exercises, and what I found that textbooks often do not even provide exercises that relate to Polish-Jewish relations or Jedwabne massacre. And Burdai's textbook is one of those that doesn't even have an exercise that would make students to reflect on the massacre or the relations. And then standard exercises that I found are, for example, to describe Nazi politics against Jews, and in this context to evaluate actions by Żegota, to compare punishments for helping Jews in Poland and Western European countries. So majority of textbooks tries to still engage with these categories of heroes and victims. And then there's only one textbook that actually tries to show those different categories of Polish and human responses to Holocaust, and that's textbook by Stoa that I mentioned before. And Stoa is actually a curator of a Jewish museum in Poland that was recently opened. Therefore, family memories are not explored, and there's no place for reflections on how Jedwabne and similar massacres and Polish-Jewish relations are remembered. Okay. And in conclusion. Okay, so Jedwabne massacre of 1941 was forgotten in communist Poland. In 2000 and 2001, Gross's book triggered a debate that was centered on around the question of Poles being perpetrators in the war. And the analysis of textbooks shows that in 1989-1990, Poles were portrayed as victims and heroes of the Second World War. Textbook published later, when engaging in discussion about Polish-Jewish relations, they add the category of bystanders. The category of perpetrators is a difficult category, and this might be because it erodes cohesive narrative of Polish victimhood and heroism in the Second World War that many textbooks try to create. And what I've noticed is that textbooks published after debate, textbooks published in 2009, offer a variety of narratives about Polish-Jewish relations in the Second World War. Therefore, I ask, are recent history textbooks in Poland voices of societal groups who compete between themselves for representations of their visions of the past? And the limitation of the study is that I haven't made the links between the societal groups and how they try to promote narratives in history textbooks. And this is one of the objectives of my research, something that I'm actually doing at the moment. if you have any questions, if you would like to get in touch, because you're too shy to speak to me afterwards, then please email me. Here you have my contact details. Thank you.
Já děkuji paní Silvii Balgarinov za příspěvek. Ona se zabývala v svém referátu masakrem v Jedvábnem, respektive o tom, jakým způsobem se v učebnicích dějepisu polských masakru hovoří, jaká vlastně je role Poláků v tom daném obsledovaném období, Poláci jako oběti, spolupřihlížející nebo Poláci jako pachatelé. Poukázala na konkrétní příklady těch polských učebnic a myslím, že stejně jako předcházející řečníci, tak dala dost podnětů k naší diskuzi. Na diskuzi máme relativně hodně času. Já se musím předem omluvit, že vás neznám jménem, to znamená, že to slovo možná přidělování slova bude někdy místy neorganizovanější z mé strany, ale přesto doufám, že se nakonec pochopíme a že nás čeká zajímavá a podnětná diskuze. Čili prosím, hlásí se někdo?
Thank you. My name is Peřich. I'd like to ask freshly after the speech of Mrs. Balgarinov. The massacre in Jedwabne was a very special event, but I'd like to ask another unhappy event, pogrom in Kielce in 1945, because Jedwabne was discussed after communist regime, but Jedwabne was commonly known during the time. So how was massacre in Kielce presented in textbooks till 1989? Thank you.
Děkuji za otázku.
Well, the answer will be very short. To start with just a comment on the Jedwabne debate. It was discussed in private spheres during the communism, but it was never discussed openly. Not in history textbooks. Okay, that's I'm pretty sure about that. The Jedwabne debate was not mentioned in Polish history textbooks under communism. When it comes to Kielce pogrom, I'm afraid that I don't have the expertise and I haven't looked at the textbooks in order to answer this question. I'm sorry.
Děkuji.
Okay, I also have a question for Silvia. Thanks for fascinating presentation. And my question is about historical parallels also, by the way. But I'm wondering about other case, about the case of Volhynia massacre and in general Ukrainian-Polish relations, which are extremely complex case during the Second World War. And I'm interested, do you find any parallels between Polish-Jewish and Polish-Ukrainian relations, how they portrayed in textbooks? Are there some similarities or these are two completely different topics? Thanks.
Děkuji za otázku.
Well, again, I don't speak Lithuanian. I haven't looked at Lithuanian textbooks, but from my knowledge and from my discussions with other people studying textbooks, history textbooks in Lithuania do not probably engage with. First of all, Poland is unusual in a way that we do have those huge hot debates about the past that we engage with, and I think the Jedwabne debate in Poland is unusual in its character. And the way it has been translated to Polish history textbooks, of course, is unusual in itself as well, as there are so many different narratives presented. And this is all I can tell. I really don't want to comment on Lithuanian textbooks, but then I can tell you that there is Polish-Lithuanian Textbook Commission, and I think looking at their work would be very important, and how they work and what changes have they introduced and what problems they struggled with.
Děkuji. Paní Osmanová.
Thank you very much for these exciting presentations. I would like to connect the presentation by coming back to the divide between history and memory at the beginning and show that the case of Jet Wagner presents a case which blurs these categories. Because when Tomasz Grosz went to the place, he didn't have sources as usual historians. He went to the population who knew about the event. So all he did as a historian was collecting oral history. And that is very important. So the event went from memory to history because he wrote it and published it, and then, very important, a transnational connection, even on a transnational level in English. So that made it public and it had to be addressed. As long as it remained local knowledge, it was not, you could just deal with it as you liked. So that's important. And I also think that rather than pitting memory against history, in this case we see how they are intimately connected, we could perhaps better talk about monologic memory and dialogic memory. A memory that is very exclusive and very homogeneous and very focused on pride and triumph and heroism or victimhood, and on the other hand, a more dialogic memory that includes also the memory of the victims, the perspective of the divorced couple, both sides. I would call this a more dialogic memory. And I think we are in the process of learning how to introduce this also into the classroom, this important shift which has started in the 1990s.
Děkuji.
Well, yeah, I do truly, I agree with transnational connection and the impact of transnational connection and this dialogic memory. I think it's very hard for me sometimes to distinguish between history and memory and what happens in textbooks. And it will be, I think, another study that should be conducted is how it actually works in a classroom. What you do is that textbooks, of course, they are in monologue, which is what is happening in the debates, in public debates, but are textbooks also in dialogue with students and their experiences and how this works out in practice.
Děkuji. Další dotaz a pak paní McGilchrist, prosím.
I would like to build on... Sorry. I'm standing. Thank you for the talks. I'm wondering about this divide between history and memory as well. One thing I'm thinking of, Peter, you were saying history operates on a different plane from memory. And then I'm wondering, in schools, does that mean that history could work as memory research in schools? So that school history would no longer actually deal with the events, but it would deal with the discussion about the events. And would that be doable? So history in schools becomes looking at memorial accounts of something. Would that be doable, or is that not what you're thinking of?
It seems to me that exactly what you propose is currently built into the Dutch and the Swedish curriculum. That is what they're proposing, is that students have an opportunity to examine how histories and memories are used by various different peoples in the present. So that becomes part of the curriculum. And I think that that's doable. To go back to the previous question as well, which I think is very closely related to this, I would like to know what the tools, to use that term, of dialogical memory are. We have a clear sense of what kinds of tools would be mobilized by history in using oral testimonies, and if we call those oral testimonies part of memory, how a historical approach could start to cope with conflicting accounts. I don't know what the tools of dialogical memory are, other than I have my opinion, you have your opinion. I don't know how that actually works, and maybe that could be specified and could help. But I would think that would start to look like a very engaged history.
exactly the difference between a diverse memory. You have so many different memory communities and you learn about them all, and they have nothing whatever to do with each other. Whereas a dialogical memory has much more to do with changing the national narrative by making it more diverse. And I think the last example was really a paradigm to show how it went from monologic, heroes, victims, then via bystanders to perpetrators. Because this is not just the Jewish memory of this, but it is our memory of it. So that makes it different. It's not just diverse, it is dialogic in this sense.
Building on the last two questions in memory and history, I have a question for all the three presenters. First of all, thank you very much. All the three were very stimulating. What I see in common in the three presentations is that we reached a point where subjectability, if I can use that word, has become acceptable. Subjectability in terms of history and teachers and textbooks. For example, Professor Seixas demonstrated that a very disciplinary matrix was used for building historical consciousness so as to connect the discipline with the human as a societal being. And then Katrin said, she said a lovely phrase of Victoria, one of the teachers, they worked on this issue for a long time, but they are common people. And then Sylvia demonstrated that we now realize that textbooks are conflicting voices and representations. So my question is, how and where do we draw a line so as not to reach a postmodern approach in schools where one, everything goes, everything is acceptable, or two, we reach nihilism where we can never have an answer and we will always disagree because we are different subjects. And each one of the textbooks will be different, and teachers will teach differently, and history will be different. Or is it valid to say that everything goes? Thank you.
I will clarify. I think certain things were not clear. Is it working?
I hope.
Well,
No.
You have to turn off.
okay, it's working now. Well, I need to clarify. When I looked at the massacre, I looked at excerpts, I looked at parts of textbooks. But it does not mean that the whole narratives of textbooks are so different. Okay, so it does not mean that these textbooks are fully dialogic with what happens in national memory and societal memory. It's not that. It's not this yet. Polish history textbooks, although they portray Jedwabne massacre differently, their narratives about the nation are still pretty in line with the national grand or master narrative, and this is because of what you said about the context and about examinations and about teachers. And history teachers teach in a traditional way very often, and Polish historians do think about portraying and protecting the Polish nation very often, and exams and who prepares exams. This is really important, I think, examinations, because those pupils are being given a textbook. They don't often even read the textbook. Teacher has this very traditional, very often teacher training, and I'm not sure whether these kids, they actually understand those different categories of perpetrators and victims and heroes. I don't think there is dialogue yet, and this actually is shown by the exercises. So also those textbooks, they do mention Polish perpetrators. Is this due to the work of Polish-German Textbook Commission? Or is this due to this transnational dimension when they want to show that we are not anti-Semitic anymore? But then where is the didactic function of it if they don't want pupils to engage with it fully, if they don't actually want to discuss those difficult Polish memories? I'm from the northeast of Poland, and this is where it happened. I was never told, we never discussed this in family circles. Okay, so I think we have to draw the line between the textbook and its application, and it's this different context that you discussed.
About this subjectivity and everything goes, first of all, there are different levels. I think most historians would not agree that everything goes. But if if one looks at some things that teachers say and even some teaching materials, then there could be this impression that, or the student could get the impression that everything goes, because sometimes really there seems that there are just very many opinions and there is no clear way to say which is better opinion than other. I think it's a question of didactical work and pedagogical proposals, because, for example, the British Schools Council project, which Professor Sykes has talked about, has exactly worked very much and deeply about this, how to teach students to understand that not everything goes and that there are means and tools to differentiate between more valid and less valid historical accounts. And there are also always different perspectives, but there are things that are simply not valid and there are things which are more or less valid based on sources and evidence and so on. And so it's then the question how teachers in different countries, how much they are aware and how much they are able to apply these things and teach these things to students, and this is connected to this context I talked about and the curriculum and how much time they have for it and how much understanding those teachers and students have. Very many levels for this. Thank you.
I think there are two levels to the question, and one is empirical, what is happening, and I think we have evidence from both the other presenters that yes, there is diversity. There's diversity among teachers. There's diversity among textbooks. There's diversity among students, and no pronouncement from a conference is going to eliminate those. And then there is the more theoretical stance. What should we be aiming for? And I would say that this is embedded in one of my earlier slides about the role of history. That history is critical. That it engages. That we present a narrative. We present an argument. We present an explanation, and then that is open to critique. And there's no point at which that is the final word on something, but there is an ongoing process, and we have a certain trust in that process. And that may, in fact, be very close to what Aleida Osman proposed as dialogical memory. It certainly is related if it's not the same thing.
Děkuji. První byl pan Letourneau a poté profesorka Ahonen.
First of all, I have to say that I enjoyed each of the presentations. One remark first, I'm not so sure that memory and history can be separated as it has been proposed, in the sense that those who are doing history as a professional profession are themselves social actors embedded in social memory. And it's very difficult for someone to take himself or herself out of such social memory. But my main point is, I wonder if one of the biggest challenge of teaching history today wouldn't be to articulate the perspectives brought by Peter and the perspective brought by Catherine. And I would have hoped that we had someone who bring the perspective from the students as well. Because when Peter says, for instance, that teaching history is about, the business of teaching history is to mobilize critical disciplinary history in a way that addresses current identities and ethical matters, I follow him all the way. But I'm afraid it might not be enough, in the sense that when we take account some of the context brought by Catherine, for instance, the political and social surroundings, the need for most students to get to some certainty, then just to live the kids, let's say aged 10, 12, 14, 15, with multiple interpretations, multiple perspectives, multiple answers, multiple questions, to leave them, in other words, in the mess of history, in the ambiguities of history, in the paradoxes of history. I'm afraid, personally, it might not be enough. I think that we've got to push a little forward. And in hearing you, I wonder if, in the end, we should not come with, I called it yesterday, big representations, but transparent big representations, in the sense that not only do we provide kids with someone to hook on, but we show them how this alternative big representations, you call it grand narrative if you want, but certainly not a mythical grand narrative, has been constructed, has been built, for what purpose, and what ethical dimensions it has in it. So, I mean, you don't leave the kids in a nowhere of sense. You provide them with a sense as complex as possible, and you reveal to the kids, in French I would say les tenants et les aboutissants, the beginning and the end of all that construction.
I heard three different challenges or questions in what Jocelyn has just proposed. First, that historians can't extract themselves from their own social memory. And of course, historians are, all we have to do is look at historiography and we see how embedded historians are and have always been in their historical moment. So there's no, that's something historians faced, and it's well recognized, and Gadamer particularly deals with it much too extensively. So that we take as a given. And I think it's certainly expressed by Roussen's matrix of historical consciousness. The second item is the need for students to have certainty. And I think the quest for certainty is certainly one that is felt and is one that is ongoing, and that it may be felt most acutely, ironically, where it's most difficult to achieve because of diverse populations in schools. So where we have in one classroom in British Columbia new Chinese immigrants and Aboriginal students and Scottish Canadian students whose families have been in Canada for many generations, there simply exists a diversity which is not addressed by a single story of Canadian development, or it has to be a very open, as you frame it, a very open and transparent kind of framework. And I would thoroughly agree with you that history teaching requires, in order to provide the kind of orientation that we seek from it, that it does require a big open narrative, just as you propose. But its openness and its transparency and it's the invitation to amend it, to criticize it, to revise it, has to be built in. So in that way, it provides a framework, but I would hesitate only where you say that this provides a certainty. It's still the conditions of the age of uncertainty, as Hobsbawm talks about it. We live in an age of uncertainty, and to respond in education by saying, well, we can provide students with certainty, I think is in part a false promise. We can only provide them with the kinds of competencies to deal with the uncertainties, the openness, the diversity, and the rapid change that they're going to be facing in their lives.
Thank you. Now, Professor Ahonen.
Thanks. Yeah, this is a good discussion. It turned into a debate, and it seems that here are two schools now. One is one wants to have, let's say, solid history lessons that provide students something to hold on, to hook on, and to get oriented in their lives. But the problem is, okay, problem about orientation is that in today's world, orientation means making choices of the road, not following a stupid GPS, just the route shown to you. So, and then, yeah, sustainability of history lessons. I would suggest this as a criteria for history education. Sustainability, like we have sustainability of development, sustainability of history education. Silvia's talk showed how within 10 years our perceptions of the past can change. So it was not, none of these textbook presentations really provided sustainable certainty to hook on. So my point is that in order to be sustainable, history has to be dialogical. That was a comment, not a question.
Yeah, thank you. The next question, yes. No. At first, the man in the white shirt. So 2 more questions and...
Good morning, my name is Adam Gajdiš from the Department of Sociology of Masaryk University in Brno. And I have a question for Katrin Kello. You have outlined 2 different basic approaches of the teachers you have interviewed towards dealing with ambiguity in history. I think this ties in very nicely with Marcel Tomášek's speech yesterday. And my question to it would be, it almost makes it seem like there are these 2 approaches that the teachers hold and represent in their practice. But what I'd be more interested in knowing and learning about is the borderline cases or the situations where the teachers perhaps have to decide for one repertoire or the other, because surely this is not a static thing. So yeah, if you could please elaborate.
Thank you for the question. I'm really happy that I can elaborate on this. It was rather so that I found in the interviews a range of different descriptions, and they were, of course, not neatly 2 or 3 or 4, but in this presentation I just tried to show the 2 like most opposite ends of this spectrum. So I also believe that the interview is just really one situation where teacher activates one of his or her repertoires which she has of talking about her practice, and in practice there probably are teachers who in different situations apply different approaches, but still there seems to be this broadly varying ends too, which show that there is a broad range of needs for certainty, for example, among teachers. And there probably are teachers who represent one or the other end, but it was a qualitative study, and I could not say how many teachers in one end and how many in other.
Yes.
I think this is a very interesting question for history teacher education. In the teacher education classroom, where my views are taken by students and expressed back to me by students, then there's a relatively uniform expression of approaches to teaching, which ends up being on one end of your continuum. And yet we know when those same teachers get into the schools and start practicing teaching, that it looks much more diverse than it does in my own classroom. And so the question for teacher educators then is, how do those transitions, how do those ambiguities play out, and what leads a teacher who, I would say in most of the teacher education programs, certainly in Canada, the approach that I take would be pretty similar to the approaches that are taught in teacher education schools across Canada. And yet what teaching looks like in the schools is at the other end of the continuum. How does that work? And I think your question gets at that slippery middle ground.
Thank you. And the last question, unfortunately last question.
Good morning. I want to thank first the panel. This is a very, very engaging panel. I wish we had more of these. But I would like to come back to an earlier point made by Jocelyn, because I haven't had a satisfactory answer from the panel. The panel spent much of the time talking about the input, about the kind of things we want for teacher education, for school history, the kinds of things that are found in the textbooks and so on. But I want to look at the other side of the coin, which is the learner. And I think one of the lessons that we've learned from the cognitive revolution is that students come to class with preconceived ideas, with stories already about the past. And Peter, you did mention that in an increasingly multicultural society, student comes with multiple representation and views of that collective past. Yet I'm not sure what you are, each and every one of you, proposing in line of what Jocelyn said, to address their preconceived ideas, which are based on different kinds of things, memory, perception, and so on. And it reminds me of this story of the three baseball referees going into a bar. And one referee says, well, for me, there's a ball and there's a strike. And I call them the way they are. So the other referee says, okay, well, to me, there's a ball and there's a strike. And I call them the way I see them. And then the third one said, no. There is a ball, there is a strike. And they are nothing until I call them. So it's kind of this way, I think, for the learners too, is that they call whether it's a strike or not, because they come with their own ideas, and we can provide them with whatever disciplinary ideas we want. But we know from research, my own, Jocelyn and others, showing that students come with fairly established ideas, what Gardner calls mental representations. And these tend to be quite firm. And unless we address these, maybe what we do is just add another layer without necessarily changing those preconceived stories.
So you're right, I did not deal with that at all in this presentation. The first paper that I published after I got to the University of British Columbia was had the title something like Students in Learning History in a Multicultural Setting. And the students were assigned to talk to a family member about a war or a conflict that there had been some personal memory of, and either that was World War II, although this was a very multicultural school, and students came with all kinds of different stories about they came from their families, but about very difficult situations. Either as Canadians or as new immigrants. In my analysis, And I didn't do anything pedagogically with this, but in my analysis, I use second-order historical thinking concepts to show how questions of cause and consequence, how questions of ethical responsibility, how questions of agency, how questions of historical significance really went to construct, that their stories really could be analyzed in those terms. And today, I think it would be very interesting, in fact, as a pedagogical tool, where we use those second-order concepts to open up the big national narratives, to use those same concepts to open up the more personal memories and family memories that students bring to class in order to help juxtapose them to each other. So I think that there are all kinds of possibilities of that. Pedagogically, I absolutely agree with you that we need to start from students' ideas.
I would say that my study is focused on context and teachers, so I'm not an expert on students, but as in my view, trying to answer your question, one should differentiate between hot topics and cooler topics from the perspective of students. So, as much as I understand, in case of emotionally hot and painful and sensitive issues, there is rather little research, and it's difficult to say how best approach and whether perhaps avoidance in some cases would be the best approach. Or generalizing also what the teachers said. But I wholly agree that in cooler topics, where we know which, and also when we, as scholars, have already this framework, which Jocelyn talked about, where this starting from students' ideas and finding the students' ideas out, and then finding some balance between dialogical history and a general framework they have attached, where dialogical approaches to would be probably the best, or the best we know now, in my opinion. But I would differentiate between emotional and sensitive issues and cooler, and these cooler have been studied more. Thank you.
Okay, it was a hell of a question, and I want to make certain points. First of all, there is some sort of assumption that student, and I'm not a practitioner, I'm a student. Now, talking. There's some sort of assumption that when students come to classroom, they have some sort of ideas, and we have to tackle them, and we have to almost deal with them. But then the question is, what do we deal with? Is it bad? Or is it something that we can actually work with, and what sort of skills the students have? And what they have are very often digital skills that we don't discuss here at all, and that they think in a different way, and very often they actually like this richness of information. And then the final point I want to make is that, can education answer this question? And a textbook is sometimes 100 pages, and students will probably spend, I don't know, a few hours reading them, and then they spend probably an hour every day on Facebook, joining different groups. So maybe when we study education, maybe we should start studying different media as well. Maybe we should really think about social media, and myself as well. I see how this media influenced me, and how I enjoy the richness. So maybe we should think about students as those who enjoy the richness, and we should not be afraid of this information. And also another thing is that we need to change this mode of thinking, this mode of being scared of this new thinking, of this richness. And also we need to maybe try to understand how 21st century students learn. And the final thing I want to say, Polish Ministry of Education is developing an e-book and it's dialogic with students right now. So I think dialogic, it's a good word also a concept that we can apply to this. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for your question. Thank you for your presentation. Thank you for this interesting discussion. And I think now it's time for coffee break, but
Cool.
Yeah, I'm the boss. Thank you as well. In order to allow the next panel to have at least similarly rich discussion, please could you spend at the coffee break a little bit less time than was planned and come here at 12 already. Once more, a reminder that the poster section out there, people are ready to answer questions or discuss their projects, ready and eager for your feedback. Thank you.
Sorry.